So I was a young fighter pilot at my first fleet squadron, VFA 143, the Pukin Dogs out of Virginia Beach. I've been in my squadron for just shy of a year at this point, and I was starting to find my groove. I was keeping my head down, my mouth shut, and just working hard and doing my job. And when I showed up to the squadron this particular day, January 15th of 2014, my squadron mate Fisty, having a morbid sense of humor like we all did to try to keep things light, he had used the Shark Tracker app on his phone and put up on the whiteboard the airspace we were going to be flying in. And underneath the airspace, he marked all these GPS positions of real-time sharks that had been tagged for research purposes.
Wow.
And it just so happened on this day that there was a 16-foot, 3,500-pound great white shark named Mary Lee. So a massive white shark right underneath my airspace. And so we were joking, today would be a terrible day to eject. You've got this massive shark, below freezing air temperatures, churned up ocean swell, and the water temperature at the nearby buoy was at near freezing at 37 degrees Fahrenheit, which whatever that is in Celsius, maybe just a few degrees above 0 Celsius. So we were joking about that, and about an hour after that conversation, I found myself out over the open Atlantic Ocean, about 50 miles off the coast of Virginia Beach, and fighting that jet. We had done an air-to-air refueling mission, and with the extra fuel and airspace, we had set up and started to do several rounds of BFM, so dogfighting the jet, pushing it to the edge of its capabilities, which was my absolute most favorite thing to get to do in that aircraft, because you're pulling G's, you're under so much physical stress, you're playing four-dimensional chess at the speed of sound, you've got so many things to think about, aircraft systems to operate, your weapon systems, your radar, your FLIR, your defensive systems, and all the time you're trying to outmaneuver this other guy who's far more experienced than you oftentimes and just not get your ass kicked. So, we're bending the aircraft. We got vapor trails coming off the aircraft. We're bending the wings. And we got to our last set of the fights for that day as we hit Joker fuel, meaning we were just about out of fuel for the day. We had just enough fuel for one short fight before we hit bingo. So we ended up setting up quite a bit lower and faster than we typically would for a typical a beam set, which is what we were executing. So we were a mile of beam in position, wing to wing. And the flight lead called, "Fight's on." We pitched our jets in. And as we came to that merge and our flight paths crossed, I already had my aircraft about 30 degrees nose low and partially inverted. And so I pulled the control stick into my lap. Typically, this maneuver would take about 5,000 feet of vertical airspace at the normal airspeeds that we would operate at. However, in the heat of all that, in the stress of all that, in the helmet fire that all that can be, I didn't quite realize the airspeed that I'd gotten up to. And so I ended up going nose low at a much higher than Top Gun recommended airspeed. And as I pulled that control stick into my lap, instead of taking just 5,000 feet, whereas I had started up at 10,500 feet for that maneuver. So in my mind, I had enough airspace vertically to execute that maneuver above the hard deck at 5,000 feet and still have a 500-foot bubble. And so in my quick mental math, that was good to go. However, as I hit bullseye nose low, pointed straight at the ocean, the aircraft hit an airspeed and put me in what's called the G bucket. So the aircraft thought that there were bombs on the wings that weren't actually there, and so it limited the amount of G I could pull as I approached transonic right before I broke the speed of sound. Now, while this protects the wings from a minor overstress, unfortunately, what it did is it put us in an out-of-control flight situation, stuck in a dive at the ocean. And I didn't realize all this at the time, like why exactly it was happening. But I remember I maneuvered the jet into a dive. I pulled the stick in my lap. I was pulling 7.5 Gs. So now with my gear and my body weight, I weighed approximately 1,600 pounds. Just my head and my Jehemix helmet weighing about 20 pounds. At 1 G now weighs about 150 pounds. And I'm craning my head up, looking up to keep sight of my adversary, because if you lose sight, you lose the fight. And you can feel all that weight. And then at that worst possible moment, I just felt that settle. And it was like going around a sharp corner in a sports car and then having your steering wheel kick back halfway. only instead of skidding off the road, I'm now just in an out of control dive straight at the ocean. There, the radar altimeter started blaring altitude, altitude, letting me know I had just broken through the hard deck, and the ocean rapidly approached. In my jihemics and in the HUD, it was showing a big arrow pointing up, and the aircraft bitch and Betty started yelling, pull up, pull up. And I'm like, I'm already pulling up. It's not pulling up any further. And at the last second, 2 seconds from impact with the ocean, as this overwhelming ground rush approached from below, I pulled the ejection handle, and I was at 51 degrees nose low, so a steep dive.
Yeah.
I was going 695 miles per hour, which was 604 knots indicated airspeed, 0.95 indicated Mach, so 95% the speed of sound at almost sea level. And, a normal ejection is incredibly violent. As that rocket motor ignites in the seat, you get an instantaneous force of 50 Gs, which compresses the spine. So it's pretty common for guys to lose, a half inch or an inch of stature permanently. And then it's very common to get flail injuries from impacting high-speed air with your arms. However, this set the record for the fastest survived ejection in naval aviation's history. And impacting the sound barrier with the body, it turns out the human body is not terribly aerodynamic at that airspeed. In the force that I impacted instantaneously as I came out on that rocket seat was 100 times the force of a Category 1 hurricane. And that airflow, it was like hitting a brick wall of air. It ripped off my helmet, traumatic brain injury. It smashed my face all up. I broke my C1 in my neck, so my top vertebrae in my neck. I broke my left scapula in the shoulder. My arms flailed violently, breaking both my upper arms, the humerus bone. My right humerus tore through the right brachial artery, causing internal bleeding. My left forearm shattered the radius and ulna and severed the median nerve that controls the left hand. The brachial plexus, which is the nerve group that kind of powers a lot of the upper body, was pinched from the spinal compressions and damaged, so I lost a lot of control of my upper body. The gear on my vest ripped off, my radio, my signaling equipment. Not that I could have used a lot of it since my arms were completely worthless at this point. My dry suit that I was wearing shredded apart. So now I was exposed to the elements. My legs flailed so violently with steel-toe boots on my feet that they became like wrecking balls, smashing open my lower legs, causing open tib-fib fractures. Chunks of my tibia were falling out of my legs. I was bleeding out now in my lower extremities, as well as that brachial artery in my arm. And this is all just in a split second.
Yeah.
By the time the ejection sequence completed, it takes about 0.4 seconds for you to exit the aircraft with that 50 G boost that goes to a 12 to 14 G sustained rocket boost as you exit the aircraft. By the time I had gotten out and the parachute started to deploy, I was at approximately 1,500 feet. And at that airspeed, I was about a second and a half from impact with the ocean. The jet impacted the ocean and vaporized. The largest pieces that they found of it were like the size of a crumpled up license plate.
Really?
The parachute miraculously deployed in that time and slowed me so that I didn't die on impact with the water. And as I plummeted into that icy cold ocean, I could feel it like needles on my skin. If you've ever done cold plunge, you know the sensation of that icy cold water as it hits your skin. And now that started to fill up my dry suit, and that became like a big soggy sea anchor. And the parachute that had just saved my life then sunk underneath the surface of the ocean and started to pull me under. And I had an LPU, fortunately, a life preserver unit automatically inflate around my neck. And that provided just enough buoyancy that on occasion I could get to the surface, get a quick breath of air, scream for help. But a lot of that time was just spent getting drugged beneath the surface. And if you've ever been held under the water and you need a fresh breath of air and you can't get it, it's a pretty awful experience. And so in my mind, this is how it ends. My dream just turned into my nightmare. I'm bleeding out in shark-infested waters, and it's just a matter of time before I either drown or Mary Lee finishes me off. Fortunately, my flight lead, he saw my parachute open. He dropped a GPS mark of my location and rapidly assumed the role of the on-scene commander to coordinate a search and rescue effort. He saw a fishing vessel about a mile from my position. He got down low and really fast, and he thumped over their bow when they wouldn't answer on maritime guard on the radio, and he was able to direct them over to my position. And while they were unable to get me out of the water, they at least provided a rough visual location for where I was at, because I was just a little tiny dark head bobbing around in the big Atlantic Ocean. My beacon had also malfunctioned. All my signaling equipment and radio were gone. So I should have just drifted off to sea and never be found again. But that was another miracle that played. And then my flight lead was able to bingo profile back to Oceana on fumes. Other aircraft were now overhead, trying to coordinate the rescue effort. And it took about 2 hours before a Navy helicopter from HSC 28 arrived, and their pilot got eyes on me. And they got down. Their rescue swimmer jumped out, a young dude named Cheech. He was able to get down and hook into the titanium carabiner on my survival gear, one of the few pieces that hadn't ripped off. And, you know, while he had trained in a warm, lit swimming pool for this very scenario, he said when he hooked into me, that force of the parachute pulled us both down beneath the surface. He said it was like trying to swim against a bag of bricks. And but his training kicked in. He got out his parachute knife. He was able to cut free all the paracord and get me back up to the surface. They put me in a sort of harness that went over and got me lift up into the helicopter. And then I spent that ride to the hospital in the helicopter. It was about a 40-minute flight. The whole way I was in and out of consciousness. I was, you know, I would be sitting up screaming and yelling and shock and terror in 1 second, and the next second I would be just completely out. They were resuscitating me with sternum rubs, doing everything they could to keep me conscious. And fortunately, I made it to the Level 1 Trauma Center in Norfolk, Virginia. When I got there, they took my core body temperature, and I was at 87 degrees Fahrenheit. So I was 1 degree away from certain death from hypothermia.
Right.
They had to do multiple blood transfusions. My kidneys were shutting down from all the tissue breakdown. But little by little, they stabilized me and induced a coma and then rushed me into surgery, where I spent the next week undergoing over a dozen surgeries where they performed fasciotomies on all 4 of my extremities to salvage them from amputation. And then they rebuilt my skeleton with titanium rods and steel plates. So now my x-ray looks like a no-kidding Wolverine x-ray. And you know, all my family and friends, as I got transferred over to the ICU at Naval Hospital Portsmouth, were in the waiting room one day waiting to hear if I was going to be a vegetable. Was I going to wake up? And at this point, it wasn't looking good until one of my squadron mates kind of piped up and goes, he's a scrappy motherfucker. He'll be all right. And so this sort of lifted the room, and they took scrappy motherfucker and they condensed it down into a makeshift acronym, SMURF. And because it's the Navy and the U.S. Navy, I don't know how it is over for you guys, but we have to have a politically correct cover story for everything. So they said I was SMURF because I'm a short guy who turned blue from hypothermia. But the real reason is it's an acronym for scrappy motherfucker. So at least out of all this, I got a call sign finally.
Yeah, absolutely. And did you buy the Hilo guys a crate of beer to say thank you? Because like that's what we do over here.
Yeah. I saw those guys out in Chicks Beach, which is a popular hangout in Virginia Beach, and I definitely bought them a lot of tequila shots.
Awesome stuff.
Yeah. So this is probably the even more remarkable part of my story, more so than the ejection, was this recovery process. After 2 weeks in that coma, the lights started to come back on. As I opened my eyes, it was like awaking from a dream, except for some reason, my bedroom was full of bright white light, beeping machines, friends, familiar faces, and everything smelled like disinfectant. And as I looked around, between the head injury and all the meds they had put me on, I was pretty loopy. But I remember looking down and seeing my arms and legs were vacuum sealed in this plastic wrap. And I had hundreds of staples and sutures on my extremities. And I remember trying to move, and I thought that they had tied me down to the bed. with like a lead blanket or something because I couldn't move, but it was because I was paralyzed. And eventually the medical staff came in and laid it out. You're lucky to be alive. You've miraculously survived this high-speed ejection. However, we don't think you're going to be able to ever walk again. You'll likely never be able to use your arms or your hands again. And your military flying career is over. And in that moment, I just had all this overwhelming darkness. I just crashed an $89 million fighter jet into the ocean. I'm going to be responsible for that. My career is over. My body's done. Like, this is the end. And I could have very easily, with all the drugs they were giving me, I could have just buried myself in a bottle of pain meds for the rest of my life and never come out of that place. But I also had this little spark in that moment, which was, what if I prove these motherfuckers wrong? What if I come back in here with my wings on my chest in my flight suit and show up and say, hey, look at me. And, you want a fighter pilot to do something, tell them it's impossible. Yeah. And fortunately, that little spark is what I started to feed day to day. And it wasn't just visualizing it or imagining it, but every day I started to work towards that goal. Everything I had all day, every day that I could, I poured into my therapy. And after 3 months of, not being able to wipe my own ass, having people have to feed me and brush my teeth and shave me and carry me around and push me around, I had regained enough function that I was able to be discharged from as an inpatient at the polytrauma center that I was at. And my healing continued from that point. I spent the next 2 years undergoing more surgeries, overcoming prescription drug addiction to the plethora of stuff they give me for nerve pain. I had to gain a stack of medical waivers. That was a miracle in itself. And there was an investigation called a FNAB, a Field Naval Aviator Evaluation Board, which is run anytime there's a mishap at that level. And that kind of culminated after months and months of my life sort of being in the balance. Am I going to lose my wings? What are the repercussions going to be? And they really do a deep dive on it. But I started to see that it wasn't so much to hang the pilot out to dry as maybe as it is in the commercial aviation world, where you see like Sully Sullenberger after saving those people in the Hudson and they were trying to hang him out and blame him. And they were even running the simulation like without any reaction time built in. So they're saying, oh, you could have made it to this airfield. You could have made it to this airfield. And luckily Sully stood up for himself. Well, do you have any reaction time? You already know it's going to happen. Let's build in reaction time. And when they did that, they saw, oh, well, you're right. And fortunately, he was cleared. But I feel, and maybe more so in the commercial aviation side of things, if you have a mishap, it's maybe going to be harsher on the pilot. And not to say it wasn't harsh to go through this experience in the Navy, but the real purpose of that investigation is to figure out what happened so that we could learn from it and we could share that knowledge to prevent it in the future. And my board concluded with me meeting with an admiral in a big, long wooden table flanked by seasoned aviators on either side. And the admiral walked into that room. We all rose out of respect, and he asked us to be seated. And I sat down looking him in the eye from across this 12-foot plus table. And he looked across at me, and the only thing he asked was, Lieutenant Gill, are you fearless? And, what do you say when an admiral asks you that question? But the only thing that seemed to come up for me was, sir, while I don't remember a lot from that ejection, I'm certain what little cushion there is on the ejection seat was puckered up inside me real tight. And he didn't laugh. He didn't blink. He just stood up and walked out of the room. And I was like, oh, there goes my flying career. And I think everybody in the room was kind of confused, like looking at each other, like what just happened? Yeah. And as the room kind of cleared out, one of the more senior pilots, an 06, a Navy captain, grabbed me and he pulled me into his office, sat me across from his table, and he popped a mint lifesaver into his mouth and he handed me one. I popped it into my mouth, and we just sat there for a moment, just sucking on these peppermints, wondering what's going on. And he looked over and he said, Lieutenant Gill, congratulations. If you can get your body working again, we'll get you back into Super Hornet. And so that was just this huge relief. As they investigated it, there was this whole sort of Swiss cheese model that had fallen apart. The flight lead took a hit because he had set us up and this non-standard beam set, which was maybe a little above my ability levels, that created a dangerous situation. I had maneuvered the aircraft at above Top Gun recommended airspeed for nose-low maneuver. And then you had this component of the aircraft flight control system that was an insidious instigator that exacerbated that issue. That is, unfortunately, that same control feature has caused mishaps prior to mine with much more senior pilots. And I know another guy who was at the pinnacle of his career, a Top Gun graduate, just a rock star, who had that system kick in when he was on a low level flying through a canyon and lost his life as that kicked in at the worst possible moment. So all things considered, I was allowed to keep my wings and get the opportunity to go back and fly, despite still having some fault to that accident. You know, I was the pilot in command. But fortunately, when you get reviewed, it's through a board of other aviators, largely in the fighter community, and they understand that job comes with risk. We are pushing the aircraft and the pilots to the edge of human capability. And that comes with its risks. And I was very fortunate to have the support of the commands, the strike fighter community behind me as I continued to recover. And I spent, it took a total of 2 years, almost to the day. I was able to max out the Navy's physical fitness test again. And the command took notice, like, how can this guy be crushing everybody in PT after everything he's been through? But they went to bat for me. And one day, the Commodore of the Strike Fighter Wing Atlantic showed up, and he said, "Lieutenant Gill, what are you doing today?" And I was sitting at a computer doing emails or whatever, you know, that I'd been doing while I was in recovery. And he said, "You want to go back and fly?" And I was like, "Yes, awesome." And I was thinking I'm going to have a few weeks or a month to prepare to go back into it. But it was like, "Oh, when am I starting?" And he said, "Today, you're classing up right now." And so with no warning, I was off into the races and back training in the F-18 again. And after retraining in the F-18, I went back to the fleet to VFA 136 Nighthawks. And this is sort of where the happy ending Disney version of my story would end. However, this is where my real struggles just began. So, you know, I made a remarkable physical recovery with my injuries to my extremities that got me back to the jet. However, there was this underlying traumatic brain injury that, you know, there's getting to be a bit better understanding of the world of traumatic brain injury and the physiology of the brain and how that can cause massive dysfunction. But at the time, it was very misunderstood. And later in my career, I started to struggle with things that used to be easy. It was getting more difficult for me to learn and memorize things, and my sleep was not very good. And I had a mission actually that I went on that ended up being my last flight in the Super Hornet. I went out and did a live fire missile exercise. I fired a 9 Mike Sidewinder missile at a drone, then broke away and got to go do some DACT with an F-22 Raptor, which was, you know, like that was just like a dream come true, is being the kid that had seen the Raptors at an air show and be like, "Whoa, I can't believe that's a Raptor." To be up in the air and fighting it.
Did you win?
I didn't win. No. I should have gone nose high with him. I went nose low, and that exposed me pretty bad to that Raptor. But I got back from that flight, and while I remembered fighting the Raptor very vividly, I had very little recollection of shooting the missile. I felt a little confused. I was having a hard time interpreting the radar symbology as I was watching my tapes in the debrief, and I was just not feeling quite right. And I just tried to tough it out. But when I went back to my hotel room and tried to get some sleep, I sat down on the bed and the whole room spun around me with vertigo. I was getting terrible vertigo, which I had never experienced. My heart was just racing. Even though I was sitting in a quiet, peaceful room all by myself, it felt like something terrible was about to happen. And I couldn't shake it. There had been a number of issues in the F-18 community with the pressurization systems malfunctioning and causing rapid decompression sickness. There had been some pilots like permanently incapacitated from this. It was becoming a serious enough problem they started to put hyperbaric facilities on the aircraft carriers. So when pilots would come back from missions with injury, they could rush them in and treat them immediately. And so what came across my mind was maybe I had decompression sickness. I contacted the safety officer that evening, and fortunately they rushed me to a a nearby dive base, and I was treated in a facility there from where we were on detachment. And overnight, I sat in that tube getting pressurized and started to feel a little bit better, but the next day I still wasn't quite right. And so the doc was like, when you get back from this detachment, I highly encourage you to go in and see the flight surgeon, which in that community, that's the last thing you want to do, is to have to go talk about something that's going on with your health, because it's likely going to spell the end of your career. And oftentimes people will just mask their symptoms and power through. But I knew there was something serious enough or wrong that I had to do something about it, or I was going to get killed or kill somebody else or crash another aircraft. And so reluctantly, when I got back, I went in to see the flight surgeon. Pretty soon after that, I got a delayed onset PTSD diagnoses, and they really did a deep dive on the sort of emotional irregularities. Why are your emotions? Why are you experiencing these bizarre things? Why can't you sleep? But the persistent insomnia continued to worsen, as did my, all the symptoms when you're sleep deprived. My life really started to fall apart. My cognition, my memory, I was getting to become very hyper vigilant all the time, on guard, high alert, fight or flight mode, and my nervous system was pegged at 11 all the time. I was getting paranoid. I was starting to come up with delusional plots, all these things that happen when you can't sleep. And they were really contributing everything to this PTSD diagnoses, which retrospectively I see that this was caused by dysfunction in my brain physiology. The hardware of my brain was damaged, and it was causing all this dysfunction. But instead of healing the hardware, they just started to try to download software upgrades and patches through talking about this, through these clinical therapies. And then before long, pills. And I had this awful experience with the pain meds and getting off of those. But again, it was presented as this is the only way for you to get better. But as time went on, I got worse. I became completely paranoid and delusional and psychotic. My wife came, she had just had her baby boy, and she'd be cooking dinner for all of us. And I would run into the room and I would dump the pan into the garbage and throw everything off the counters, freaking out because I thought we were being poisoned. And I was being poisoned, but it was in these FDA approved pills that they were filling me full of. Everything got really bad from that point. I lost my identity as a pilot. I saw that I was likely never going to get to go back and fly. I felt that I had let everybody down that had supported me to get back in the cockpit. And I just felt like a total failure. And late one night, I was laying in bed, and I kept a sidearm in my bed and the end table, and I was going to go reach for it. I was thinking, what's the gun oil going to taste like on my tongue? What'll the muzzle feel like on my teeth? And I was just walking through that, ending my life. And I looked over to my left, and luckily my wife and my newborn son were laying right next to me. And I didn't want to wake them up like that. But had they not been there in that moment, I would have joined the 44 plus veterans a day, American veterans a day, killing themselves. I ended up going through a medical board, being medically retired from the military after what I call the bureaucratic equivalent of the Indiana Jones Temple of Doom. It was an absolute bureaucratic nightmare to get through that process. And when I got out, we moved back to Northern Michigan, where both our families were from. And I continued that treatment at the VA. And that just meant more of these pills. And the pills continued to increase as I continued to get worse. And one day my wife came home from a job interview. She's a trauma nurse. She came in to the house and found me wrestling around in one of the bedrooms. And when she peeked around the corner, to her surprise, I was standing there completely naked. I had shaved off my hair in chunks. I had shaved off my eyebrows, my facial hair. And the only thing I was wearing was I had a black plastic garbage bag tied around my neck like a cape, because I thought I was like Batman, and I was going to go out into the snowy Michigan weather and fight crime like a superhero. I was in a full-blown psychosis from months and months of not sleeping and all these meds in my system. I was completely over the top at this point. I was admitted to the emergency room. I awoke a few days later after I had been transferred down to a VA inpatient psychiatric facility that helped veterans dealing with severe mental health crises. And when I came to, I really saw absolutely abysmal treatment of American veterans. I had become a prisoner of the war on mental health that is going on within the United States. And the treatment that I witnessed, in lucid moments there parallels that of how you would treat a prisoner of war, to break them and get them to comply and to tell you what you wanted to know. Only instead of getting information from us, they were just trying to get us to take more meds and comply with whatever they put in our pill bottles that day. But the things that they were doing were sleep deprivation. So it's already a very difficult place to sleep to begin with. You're woken every 15 minutes with a flashlight in your face to make sure you're safe. Is a policy in those hospitals. Yes, it's completely absurd. It's already a hard place to sleep in because you're in a room with other guys that are dealing with psychoses. Everything's hard tile
So there's
floors and
like,
concrete
it's not
walls.
like you don't have a single room. There's other people all
No,
around you.
you share rooms,
Oh,
and
right.
so there's other people yelling and screaming all night, in and out of psychoses. Everything echoes. Everything's white fluorescent lights that just beam into your window, into your rooms. So you're not sleeping, which is probably the single most detrimental thing. Having gone through some survival training in the military, we get a little taste of what it would be like to be a prisoner of war. And even after taking a perfectly physically and mentally robust military member, pilots, special forces members, and you sleep deprive them for a few days, you malnourish them, you stress them out, you treat them less than human. Well, guess what happens to a perfectly healthy person is they start to have delusional thinking. They start to have visual and auditory hallucinations. And that's a perfectly healthy person. Now you take somebody who's already in a psychosis and you do the same things to them. The food that we were eating was absolute junk, ultra processed prison food. There's not a fresh fruit or vegetable in sight. You're confined into a small facility. We were lucky if we got to go outside once a week into a concrete yard surrounded by metal fences and brick buildings. There's no connection to sunlight, no nature. We're actually dressed like prisoners. As the patients, you
Really?
wear scrubs, prison scrubs, and the staff members wear white lab coats. So there's this sort of Stanford prison experiment dynamic that builds.
Of course.
So it's just thing after thing that break you down. And just the only option they have is massive amounts of these pills. Anyways, with the support and advocacy of my family, I eventually, after 40 days approximately in that facility, I got out and went back home to Michigan. And I was a broken human. I was at the end of my life. In my mind, I just wanted to walk out into the woods and in my own life. My little boy and my daughter would come up and try to play with me, and I would just push them away and tell them to leave me alone. And the only thing that was holding my marriage together at that point was my wife was afraid that if we got a divorce, that I would somehow gain custody of our children, at least in part, and I would go into a psychosis and injure our children. And so sort of my life was a disaster. And the pills just kept coming. After I got out of the facility, it was just even more pills than when I went in. And my condition worsened. The only emotions I could feel were rage and betrayal for the government that I had served. How could they not care about me? How could this be the treatment we get? But I was very fortunate to come across a number of organizations, veteran nonprofit organizations that provided alternatives to healing through traumatic brain injury clinics, through nutraceutical supplementation, through psychedelic assisted therapy, a lot of things that are just not available oftentimes in our country, or especially not through the VA or conventional health insurance. But over the course of a few years, through these alternative modalities and rebuilding my lifestyle, refocusing on sleep, nutrition, hydration, exercise, sunlight, getting outside, connecting with community, reassimilating into a family and finding a tribe, I was able to rebuild my life. And now, I'm here talking to you. I'm a motivational speaker. I'm a coach. I help other people going through similar struggles in life and optimize their health. I'm an author of my book that just released in January, Phoenix Revival, The Aftermath of Naval Aviation's Fastest Survived Ejection. There's obviously a lot more to the story. We kind of hit some of the highlights of it today, but there's far much more in that book, and including a lot of resources for anybody who may be finding themselves dealing with some mental health challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, thank you very much, Smith, for sharing your story there. I mean, wow, that's I
Of
mean,
course.
incredible. But it's great that you had support and obviously your family stuck with you as well. That must have been like a big help for you.
Yeah, I was really fortunate that they did because I wouldn't be here without them.
So this is from Joe Kunzler. Tell us how field carrier landing practice and landing on the boat is like in the Super Hornet.
Yeah, so before you get to go land on the aircraft carrier for real, we do a very robust field carrier landing practice syllabus, as well as emergency procedure and procedural training in the simulators that really get to torture you and push you to the edge of your capabilities in some awful situations. And while the field carrier landing practice helps you really get a feel for the Super Hornet, nothing can really prepare you for what it's actually like to land on the aircraft carrier. But it does help to build some basic skills. Um, but once you get out to the aircraft carrier, I know we talked a little earlier about that process, but it's incredibly challenging. And also one of the most exhilarating feelings I've ever had is catching one of those wires after this, 100% focus for about 18 seconds as you're coming in on that glide slope and trying to fly your head through that 1 foot by 1 foot box. You're doing everything you can with just the most subtle little movements of the throttle and stick. You're really feeling through the seat of your pants for any little changes that you can feel in the seat of your pants before you can see them on the iFlaws system, the visual glide slope that you're flying. So it's really kind of the extreme capabilities of the human, hand-eye coordination. There's an analogy between landing on the boat and baseball. Being able to hit a
Ah,
baseball
yes.
because you don't know what's going to happen with that ball, but you got to be ready to hit it. And just the slightest little, almost imperceptible shifts are really where you make the difference between being a good ball flyer or crashing into the back of the aircraft carrier and ending your life. But the feeling when you do touch down and you catch the target wire and your body shifts forward,
Yeah.
and that deceleration force is squeezing the air out of you, and you look up and you see the deck crew telling you, pull back the throttle and you taxi out. That's just such a relief and awesome feeling. And then you're like, well, I want to go do it again. Uh, at least that's how I felt about the daytime stuff. As far as night carrier landings, I never got comfortable with that. It's absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, I can imagine. But hopefully that answers your question, Joe. But yeah, so Smurf, can you talk us through your book, Phoenix Revival, and did it help with your recovery as well?
Yeah, as I started to recover and get better and become reattached to a sense of purpose, I really felt a calling to share my story because I know a lot of other people go through similar struggles. And, whether you're a military member or a soccer mom or whatever, we all go through these challenges in our lives where our mental health or physical health may deteriorate, or we go through hardship and struggle and trauma. That's just part of being human. And so I wanted to create something to help inspire and guide other people through that process. And I really felt a calling to share my story. Now, when I sat down and actually started writing it, there were definitely some challenging spots, but it was very therapeutic. It was really ripping the Band-Aid off and getting in there and scrubbing out these deep wounds that I had accumulated, and these emotional wounds. And it was like exposure therapy, really, to be able to go into the level of detail and the emotion and describe that on paper in a way that the reader can absorb it and understand really required me to do a deep dive emotionally back into those experiences and memories. To the point, there were times when I was writing my book and I would go through some of the really hard stuff, especially the things with the VA inpatient facility that were haunting me. And I'd get done writing about them, and I would be in a funk for like weeks. My wife was like, you got to stop doing this to yourself. But I'm so glad that I was persistent and I got through those hard times, because now I have this resource for people to maybe help inspire them and guide them through their own challenges.
And where can we find your books online? Are they on Amazon? Is it directly from your website? Or
Yeah, the easiest place to get it is just head over to Amazon. You can get delivered to you. It's going to be hard. There's a hardcover, paperback, ebook, and I also recorded the Audible if you're an audiobook fan. So please head over there and check it out.
Awesome stuff. That'll be linked in the description. But we've got a couple of personal ones to wrap up here, Smurf. So do you have any hobbies?
Yeah, actually woodworking, as you can see behind me here. This is actually a surfboard that I built. When I was going through some of my challenges, I had a friend named Leo. He's a SARC, so basically a special forces medic. And the special forces communities actually use woodworking as a healing tool for trauma. And one day he just gave me a block of wood. I think it was actually my birthday. And at that point I wasn't a woodworker and I didn't really know what I was going to do with this block of beautiful wood that he gave me. But I decided to start getting into woodworking, which he had inspired. And as time progressed, I got into bigger and bigger projects. And now I build these hollow wooden surfboards. I glass them, I put fins on them. You can ride them. I also surf, kiteboard, some other things I love to do. Ultra endurance sports for a while. I was doing ultra endurance running and mountain biking. And while I've kind of lost my drive for ultra endurance, I still do some mountain biking. And my latest passion is jujitsu. I got into it about a year ago and I absolutely love. There's something incredibly therapeutic about other grown men trying to choke you out and not dying. It's about the most effective mental health tool I've ever found is getting choked out.
I think you need to get on to Joe Rogan's podcast because he's a big jiu-jitsu fan, isn't he?
Oh yeah. I'd love to talk to him if he ever finds out who I am. Sign me up.
We'll try and figure that out. But okay, I probably know this one, Smurf. But favorite aircraft you've flown?
While the Super Hornet is incredible, one of my favorite flights and probably my most favorite memory of flying was my friend Scott has this little J3 Piper Cub on floats.
Nice.
It's got a cork bobber for the fuel gauge. It's got a tachometer, an airspeed indicator, and that's about it. No radios, no electric start. You got to hand start the thing. But going up and flying that with my buddy Scott, we're wearing board shorts and flip-flops. There's no headsets, awesome. No radio calls, no flight plans. And then you just launch off the beautiful lakes up here in Michigan, which for people that aren't familiar with Michigan, it's basically where a bunch of glaciers melted. So everything's a lake. Every direction you go, there's a lake. And it's a beautiful place to fly. But just puddle jumping around on that little J3 Cub was one of my fondest flying memories for sure.
That's awesome. One you would like to fly either past or present?
Ooh, I would love to learn to fly helicopters.
Right.
I almost went that route in the military, and that was actually my initial draw. And I've gotten to ride in them, but I think it would be really cool to have a helicopter and just buzz around and land wherever you want. I don't know if you guys know the comedian Bill Burr.
Bill Burr, yeah.
He's a helicopter pilot,
isn't he? Yeah.
And you see him like flying around, just like landing in his buddy's yard and be like, "Hey, what are you doing today?" Like
it's landing.
That looks that looks like a great time.
Yeah, awesome stuff. So Smurf, like to wrap up, is there anyone you want to shout out or people you would like to mention?
A huge shout out to my wife, Kara, to my family, to the squadron mates and family and friends who helped me get through this. This is not a journey that you can manage alone. And I had an immense amount of support the entire way through. There's a number of nonprofit organizations that have really helped me. Heroic Hearts Project, Vet Solutions, Angel Warrior Foundation, Defenders of Freedom, No Fallen Heroes. The list goes on of the generosity and support that has helped me get my life back and to heal my brain at the root cause level. And to help others out there, if you're looking to support an organization, I'm working with an organization largely of other military aviators, and we're trying to rebuild a healthcare system that will provide veterans with the same care that I was fortunate to navigate through on my own. It's called the Davis Focus Project. You can look them up at davisfocusproject.com. It's an incredible cause. What we're basically doing is we're able to take in a veteran, give them advanced diagnostics to figure out where their physiology is disrupted, and then provide them healing modalities, both in-house and through a network of nonprofit organizations, to get them out the other side as a healthy, happy, productive member of society. And our goal with this project is to not only serve veterans, but also to be able to help people that are active duty optimize their health, so people don't have to get to the point where they have to be medically retired or out of service or struggling with their family lives, and do this more proactively. But please check out the davisfocusproject.com. This is the future of healthcare, and I think this is going to become the gold standard in the future. But we've got to build it ourselves.
SMURF, thank you very much for coming on the channel and sharing your story. And I'm sure we'll have you back on, because it's been brilliant chatting to you.
Likewise, thanks for having me on. I look forward to the next time.